Writers Radio. I'm Carol Harmon, your host for Good Bedtime Stories. Twice a year, we have a themed open call for submissions from our pool of writers. When I asked for Good Bedtime Stories, I didn't know what to expect. What I didn't expect was that two of the writers would be blood relatives and the other two know one another from shared writing classes. This was serendipity at work. We begin with Jeremy Page and Alison Goeller, who met online. Alison says, "We were in an online class on mystery writing and were eventually paired off for critiquing each other's work. We've kept in touch and occasionally send each other our work." Author, editor, and translator Jeremy Page lives in Lewes, England. He writes both prose and poetry. Jeremy is former director of language studies at the University of Sussex and founder of the literary journal The Frogmore Papers. Here is Jeremy reading The Ghost of Haversham Halt.
And all that, young Dickens, the station master concluded, happened 100 years ago tonight. Dickens gaped in awe. It was a terrible tale of how a signalman's drunkenness and the late arrival of the down train had together caused a horrifying crash in the tunnel outside Haversham Halt, in which scores of people lost their lives. Dickens and old Jasper, the station master, were warming themselves by the fire in the office while they waited for the last train to pass through. "Of course, the 11:30 don't stop here anymore," Jasper went on, "but I like to see it safely through the Halt before I go home to my bed." "What became of the signalman?" asked young Dickens. "Drank hisself into an early grave, so they say. That's him in the photo over there, the ugly-looking brute with the hare lip. Some do say they've seen his ghost around these parts and heard noises in the tunnel. I've witnessed nowt myself. Still, it wouldn't surprise me if his ghost couldn't rest, for as I told you, when those two trains collided that midnight, he was fast asleep from the drink." The phone rang. Jasper grunted into the receiver a couple of times and hung up. "That were Ted from up the line. The down train's had engine trouble. It's running half an hour late." The old station master looked thoughtful. "Strange that should happen tonight, of all nights. They'll have to hold the up train. Oh well, thank God for the modern signals, that's what I say." Shortly before midnight, they put on their coats and went out to wait for the train. Jasper noticed a figure along the platform. "Excuse me, sir," he called. "The train don't stop here anymore." The figure turned to reveal the face of a man ravaged by drink and a hare lip. The train thundered into the station, and as the two men looked on in horror, the figure threw itself onto the track and under its wheels. Looking up, young Dickens saw the awful expression on the face of the driver as he slammed on his brakes. The train ground to a halt yards short of the tunnel, and the driver sprang from his cab. "Did you see that?" he cried. "There was nothing I could do." Jasper was looking down at the line in wonder. "It's all right," he said. "You haven't killed anybody. He was dead already." Then the phone was ringing in the office, and in a daze, Jasper went to answer it. "Hello, Haversham Halt. Jasper, is that you? Thank God. Look, man, you've got to stop the down train. There's been the most awful signal failure, and now the up train's broken down in the tunnel." Jasper was silent. "Do you hear me, man? You've got to move fast. There could be a terrible accident." "Don't worry, sir. Everything's under control. There won't be any accident." The signalman had laid his own ghost to rest.
Alison Goeller is a former professor of American literature, now living in Uzès, a medieval town in France. Her murder mystery series features locksmith Will Sargent and his wife Poppy. Characters inspired by Alison's locksmith uncle, Gil Deming, and his wife, Phyllis. Alison reads an excerpt from Murder in Provence. Will and Poppy are visiting their niece, Abby. While looking for clues to the murder of Abby's professor, Will finds himself trapped in an old wine cellar.
When Will regained consciousness, he found himself lying in total darkness on the damp dirt floor. A musty odor, was it mold, filled his nostrils, nearly choking him. He realized he was shivering, and his head throbbed. He touched the back of it and felt an oozy substance on his fingers. Blood? How had that happened, and where was he? He tried to recall where he had been before this. He and Poppy had been walking together in the garrigue, looking at wildflowers. His knee had been acting up, so he decided to go back to Abby's to rest. But then he had taken a detour to the chapel to check on something. But what? Oh yes, now he remembered. The trowel. He had stumbled on it the night they found the professor. Had nearly fallen, in fact. Abby thought it odd it was there, outside the perimeters of the dig site, but she was sure it belonged to her team. In fact, after they discovered the professor inside the chapel, Will and Abby both concluded the trowel must have belonged to the professor. He was out here looking for something, Uncle Will, but what, Abby had said. Whatever it was, he had been killed over it, they were sure, and now Will had nearly been killed too. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized he was in an old wine cellar. Wooden casks the size of smart cars lined the walls on both sides of the cellar. Thick cobwebs hung everywhere. The musky odor that had assaulted him when he regained consciousness lingered in the air like a thick cloud. He rolled over on his side and tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea washed over him. He lay back down and took a few deep breaths, something Poppy had taught him to do after his knee surgery, when he had begun taking his first steps. Poppy. She would be worried sick when she came back from the garrigue to discover he wasn't there. Abby, too. He wondered how long he had been lying there. He reached in his pocket for his smartphone, then remembered he had given it to Poppy when he left the garrigue, in case she needed help. Now he was the one who needed help. He tried sitting up again, but it was no use. The pain in his head was too intense. He rolled over on his back, took more deep breaths, and tried to think. There had to be a door in the cellar. If he could find the door and get to it, maybe he could find his way out. But first he needed more light. He felt in his pocket for his through-night T Mini. Over the years, Will had owned many pocket flashlights, but the T Mini had proved to be the best, most efficient, and at the same time most powerful of them all. It ran on a simple AA battery and was so slim it could easily fit in a pocket or purse. It had saved the day on many occasions. Now he prayed it would save his life. He pulled the flashlight from his pants pocket and with his fingers felt for the switch, all the while aware of his trembling hand. Praying the battery wasn't dead, he pushed his thumb against the switch. A thin but bright ray of light streamed onto the dirt floor. Thank goodness, he muttered to himself. Now for the hard part. He managed to turn over onto his side again and began moving the flashlight up and down, right and left, searching for a door. Sure enough, halfway down the cellar to the right was what looked to be an old wooden door about 10 yards from where he lay. But how would he reach it? He knew standing was too risky. His head felt as if it might split in two at any moment. He might pass out again, and then what? He'd have to somehow wiggle his way to the door. Turning onto his back, he began rocking from side to side, while at the same time pushing forward with his buttocks. He had seen a similar movement at one of those modern dance performances at the university Poppy liked dragging him to. As he recalled, much of the performance consisted of scantily clad bodies writhing on the floor to the tune of Summertime. Afterwards, he and Poppy had had a heated discussion about what exactly constituted dancing. He could only imagine what he must look like now, inching along the floor like a wounded animal. He was just grateful the dirt floor was relatively soft and that his extra layer of fat from all those late-night snacks provided good padding for his back and buttocks. When he finally got to the door, his next challenge was to reach the doorknob. He turned once again onto his right side and, propping himself up on his elbow ever so carefully, reached his left arm up to the knob. Voila, Will said to himself. So far, so good. But when he grabbed the knob and turned it, it didn't budge. Well, of course, he said to himself, that would have been too easy. Now what? For the second time that week, Will found himself in front of a locked door without his locksmithing tools, trying to think how he could open it. A bobby pin had worked at the chapel, but he didn't have a bobby pin. A screwdriver might have worked, but he didn't have that either. He slid his left hand down his left pants pocket, searching for something that might do the trick. The key to Abby's house? Doubtful. A few coins? Not a chance. A balled-up handkerchief? Are you kidding? And a packet of Tums? Not on your life. Then he felt his left back pocket. His wallet was still there. Obviously, whoever had knocked him over the head wasn't interested in his money or his credit cards. The credit cards, of course. As with many of his Rube Goldberg techniques, picking a lock with a credit card was a technique he had learned on a YouTube video. He had practiced it in his shop, on his own door, and had then used it a few times on calls. He wasn't at all sure it would work this time, but what did he have to lose? He removed the wallet from his pocket, flipped it open, and pulled out his Visa card. The next step would be tricky. He would need the flashlight, so he had to figure out how he could maneuver the flashlight in one hand and the card in the other. Once again, he propped himself on his elbow. Then, shining the flashlight toward the door handle, he slipped the card in the small gap between the door and the door jamb, just above the handle, and slid it downwards at a perpendicular angle, wiggling the card as it slid. Now to apply some weight, he thought. He then bent the card in the opposite direction and, raising his left foot, pushed it against the door. The trick he had learned from practice was to slip the card under the angled end of the bolt. Otherwise, the bolt would spring back into its locked position. He needed to find the magic combination of wiggling and pushing that would finally pop open the door. And magic was a good word for what he was attempting. It occurred to him that the door probably hadn't been opened in years, so trying to move the bolt might be a lesson in futility. But in the 15 years he'd been a locksmith, not once had he failed to open a door. Now that his life depended on it, was his skill about to fail him for the first and thus the last time? His head was still throbbing, and he was feeling weaker and weaker. He wasn't sure how much longer he could work at it before what little strength he had gave out. He tried once more, this time angling the card even more, and giving the door one final shove with his foot. Suddenly the bolt gave way. Thank God, he said. He pushed once more against the door and felt a rush of warm, stale air. But he was still inside. As he moved his flashlight back and forth, up and down, he saw before him a set of stairs covered in thick green vines. At the top of the stairs was what appeared to be a trap door. I'm beginning to feel like Alice in the rabbit hole, he thought. Now what? He'd have to climb the stairs. There was no getting around it. But how? Standing was out of the question. If he fell, he might never get out alive. Well, he said to himself, he had crawled on his back to the door, he could crawl up the steps. There were 5 steps. If he took his time, he could reach the top. And after? Well, he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. He pulled the credit card out from the door, slipped it back into his wallet, and put the wallet back into his pocket. Once again, on his back, he shimmied his way through the open door, then taking a deep breath, began hoisting himself 1 step at a time up the vine-covered stairs. He kept his head down to avoid dizziness. Finally reaching the top of the stairs, Will considered his next move. Most likely the trap door was padlocked on the outside. If that was the case, there wasn't much he could do except try to force the door open with the weight of his body. It was a long shot, but he'd have to try. Leaning into the door with his shoulders, he attempted a push, then another push, then another, but the door didn't budge. Well, I guess there are worse places to die than in a French wine cellar, he said to himself. But I'd just as soon get out of here if I can. There was nothing left to do but start banging on the trap door as hard as he could. Maybe, just maybe, someone would hear him, someone who could help him get back to Poppy, back to safety, back to his life.
Author, editor, and creative writing teacher Ingrid Rose, my co-editor for Writers Radio, lives in Vancouver but was born and raised in London, England. Her mother was a Buckman before her marriage. Peter Buckman is Ingrid's cousin. Serendipity has been at work again, as both Ingrid and Peter submitted intriguing pieces about standing stones. Ingrid reads Power of Attraction.
He puts his hands on her shoulders, pushes her down into a crouching position. Stand here. Look as far as you can see. She casts her eyes over the field, moving away in dark folds. A light pressure on her shoulders directs her to slowly turn. See how it moves? Anti-clockwise. She straightens up into the warmth of his hands, into the turning, breathing in the dim horizon, stones, hill, forest held in liquid force. He moves away, and she sees his hand is now shadowing long-sighted brown eyes, grazing the distance. Their relationship started with stones, ended with stones. Their life together interspersed with megaliths. He reads them against their shadows, teaches her to throw her short-sighted gaze to the horizon, to find which way it turns. An arced reading, changing relationship to place, volumizing our reach for the stars. Poetry is exactitude of place and space, he says. They've driven from London to Wiltshire. Suddenly, on the winding road, on the crest of a hill, Stonehenge rises up like a mirage, filling the windshield with a circle of monk-like figures bearing huge coffin-shaped stones above them. Stones quarried from where? How? By who? A pile of unquarried questions. Wind combs Salisbury Plain. She wraps the shawl tighter around her, but icy fingers prick her skin under the plaid shirt. The sun hasn't risen yet. He's already striding the perimeter of the mammoths. She shelters in between two of them, locked in dance so close to one another, they imprint her body with their gyrations. Grey mottled backs, alien and cold under her touch. Nimbus clouds, also grey and mottled, lumber overhead menacingly. She can feel the damp on her cheeks as slowly she begins to weave in and out of the giants, searching their facelessness for something. She doesn't know what. They slant, aloof, silent, impervious to weather. Far away, outside the hefty circle, he is a scarecrow figure, coat and scarf flapping, as he prowls round the heel stone, stops, angles his body, takes pictures, pacing out the distance between stones, counting. She calls him by name, but it's shredded by the wind, a howl inflaming her ears. Her arm, rising, is caught in the net of her shawl. A hollow retort blasts out behind her. "Now you!" She spins round, sees a figure in uniform battling its way toward her, clothes ballooning in the gust. "What? Cut! You!" Blurts of sound reach her as wind gulps the words. We didn't." Her eyes water. As it nears, the figure reveals itself to be a man with a round face. "You can't just come in here like that. There's signs, regulations." "We didn't know. We just came across the fields." She turns to her companion, who's now joined them. "He says we're not supposed to be here." The scarf tugs away from his neck. In the dawning light, she can see under his beret, his eyes threaten. "That's right, little lady. Rules. These stones are private property." "We just wanted to look." "There's some put graffiti on them. Desecration." The guard's eyes are bright blue and dart from hers to her companion's, then settle on her, sensing her tractability. "Ealing they are. I've been around them for years, not a day sick." She senses her companion's impatience to continue his investigation of the stones, fishes for the guard's attention. "In what way?" The roundness of his face has smoothed out any sign of age. "I'm a smoker, you see. I know it's no good for you, but fit as a fiddle I am, because of em." His body jerks in the direction of the stone circle. He leans toward them into the wind, a smoker's voice. "Feel the pull of them?" Oddly enough, she does, and also leans, in spite of the wind, pulled by the stones. Stonehenge spins at the corner of her eye as the wind blares out over its kingdom. Her companion turns on his heel, bends his knees, angles his camera, clicks, rises, clicks, bends, clicks. The guard raises his arm in warning, approaches her and puts his hand on her arm, shouts at her companion's receding back. "Come along then! You two got to be off!" She looks into his blue eyes, nods her head, indicates she'll go and fetch her companion. He releases her arm. As they head back to the car, she stuffs her freezing hand into his coat pocket. Her frigid fingers burrow into his warm ones. Stonehenge disappears behind them, in the morning mist.
English author Peter Buckman has written books, plays, and scripts for film, television, and radio. His long career in publishing includes founding Ampersand Agency, a UK-based literary agency. Here is Peter reading The Spectre of the Stones.
My sister was staying with us one Midsummer's Eve when the vicar dropped in. He often did, even though we weren't believers, because he knew he could rely on a stiff drink after the gallons of tea pressed on him by his lady parishioners. As he relaxed with a single malt, he happened to mention that he'd been asked to go to the Rollright Stones at midnight. The woman who then owned them wanted him to bless and protect them, to prevent a repeat of the previous year when someone had tried to sacrifice a puppy to Satan. The vicar, a tolerant and amiable man who maintained the local god was Pan, and readily agreed. My sister, who lived in Islington and thought the worst that could happen in the country was that a spider dropped into your muesli, immediately asked if she could go too. I was uneasy because I don't like messing with other people's rituals, but my sister nagged the vicar until he said yes, and then she nagged me too. In the end, I tagged along with a show of reluctance and a hip flask to provide brotherly support. It was a fine night, dry and cool, with clouds scudding across the moon that made shadows skitter down the fields to the whispering knights huddled below the stone circle. I showed my sister the King's Stone, looking sternly out over 4 counties, but then we joined half a dozen other people in the circle itself. The trees whispered and creaked, but we felt quite snug, as if the stones were protecting us. Those present included the owner and some friends, a couple of archaeologists who went round patting the stones and murmuring to them, a uniformed policeman, and the vicar, in billowing white surplice and stole. He held a large cross in one hand, and in the other a plastic bottle that might have contained washing-up liquid. My sister immediately inquired about the bottle's contents and was told to wait and see. The vicar then decided to entertain us with a story of how he was called to a nearby cottage where an upside-down cross had appeared. It shone through everything that was put in front of it, from a horse blanket to a wardrobe, until he performed a full exorcism and it disappeared. My sister giggled nervously, and though I don't believe in ghosts, I took a big pull at the hip flask to make my neck hairs lie down. Being surrounded by an edifice older than Stonehenge that might have been used for anything from selling local produce to sacrificing local virgins was suddenly a little scary, especially when an owl shrieked and the sensible creatures in the fields scuttled away to hide. As midnight approached, the vicar went round each of the stones, said a prayer, and squirted the contents of the plastic bottle on them. It was what he kept his holy water in. When he'd finished, the archaeologist suggested we hold hands and listen. My sister gave me a funny look, but she grabbed my hand and we all formed a circle. A car slowed down, but rapidly drove off again, obviously alarmed by the sight of grown-ups holding hands by moonlight. Or maybe it was the presence of the police. Anyway, we were left to listen to the silence. There was a strange hum, as if there was a current rising up from the stones that made everything jangle. It wasn't sinister, but it wasn't pleasant either, a reminder perhaps of ancient powers that may have resented our presence. Then the church clock in the village below began to strike 12. On the 5th stroke, there was a rustling in the field. It must have been made by something larger than a rabbit or a deer, and it got louder and nearer. On the 6th stroke, we heard scrabbling, which on the 7th turned into sobbing. Yet none of us could move, as if the stones and the chimes held us in some sort of spell. My sister just managed to tighten her grip on my fingers, and though that hurt enough to make me open my mouth, I couldn't utter a sound. It was like a nightmare when you can't frighten off a nameless threat with a shout of warning. Only this time I didn't wake up in a sweat. When the clock struck 8, the sobbing turned to rasping. On 9, it became moaning. On 10, there was panting. On 11, there was a despairing and high-pitched howl. And as the last stroke died away, a figure appeared. It started small, and then it seemed to grow in front of us. It was all in white, and it was holding, upside down, a large cross. There was that frozen, dreamlike silence that seems to go on forever. Then the apparition spoke. "Sorry I'm late," it said. "My watch stopped, and I thought I'd run across the fields. I fell and tore my trousers. Have I missed it all?" No one dared speak until our vicar stepped forward. "Martin," he said, "what are you doing here? I've already done the business." "Oh, that's all right," said the owner cheerfully. "I thought if I got the two of you along, we'd be doubly protected. Nice of you to join us, Martin. Now, who'd like some cherry cake and coffee?"
You have been listening to Jeremy Page, Alison Goeller, Ingrid Rose, and Peter Buckman reading Good Bedtime Stories. Thanks for listening to this episode during the busy holiday season. On behalf of my cohorts at Writers Radio, Ingrid Rose and Gary Sill, we wish you all health and happiness for the coming year.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Sechelt Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.